Welcome back to Inside Vietnam. I'm glad you're here, and I mean that in the way I always mean it with this channel, because the stories we tell are not comfortable ones, and the people who find us are usually looking for something specific, a warning, a mirror, or just the reassurance that someone else has been through something hard and come out the other side able to talk about it. Today's story is a little different from most of what we cover here. Most of the time, when a Western man ends up in serious trouble in Vietnam, there's a romantic pursuit at the beginning of it. A loneliness that sharpened into something that looked like love and turned out to be something else entirely. That pattern is real, it's common, and we've documented it many times on this channel. But Declan Murtagh didn't come to Vietnam looking for a woman. He came because he wanted to eat well and be warm and stop being in Limerick. That's it. That was the whole plan. And I want you to hold on to that, because I think it matters. Because what happened to Declan, a 54-year-old former head chef from the west of Ireland, who'd spent 35 years being the most competent person in any room he walked into, didn't happen because he was foolish or desperate or blinded by something he should have recognized. It happened in a way that was specifically designed to work on a man who was none of those things. I'll say this much before I hand over to him. By the time Declan's story reaches its end, he lost more than most people earn in a year. He'd lost it methodically, slowly, in a way he participated in at every stage, and couldn't see until it was finished. And somewhere along the way, the Irish government temporarily stopped his pension payments while he was sitting in a foreign country with almost nothing left in his account. This one's going to stay with you. Here's his story, in his own words. Right. So, I started in kitchens when I was 19. That was 1987. I was working in a hotel in Limerick City, the kind of place that did weddings and business lunches and thought itself fairly grand on the basis of having tablecloths. I was a kitchen porter first, washing dishes, the usual. Within 6 months, I was on the prep section. One liked it. I liked the speed of it, and I liked being useful in a way you could measure. Either the mise en place was done or it wasn't. Either the sauce was right or it needed work. There was no ambiguity. I found that appealing at 19, and I find it appealing now, if I'm honest. Over the next few years, I worked my way up through a few different kitchens, a gastropub in Clare, a stint at a golf club in Tipperary that I try not to dwell on, back to Limerick for a while, and then at 30 I took a contract on a catering vessel in the North Sea. 8 months feeding oil workers off the coast of Norway. I do not recommend it. The pay was good, the weather was not, and there is something philosophically bleak about making a beef bourguignon in a kitchen that's pitching 15 degrees in both directions. But I did it. Came home with money saved and went straight back into hotel kitchens because it's what I knew. By my mid-30s, I was running sections. By 40, I was a head chef with a small team under me. By my mid-40s, I was managing kitchens, the whole operation, staffing, ordering, costing, the lot. I was good at it. I want to be clear about that. Not because I'm looking for credit, but because it's relevant to understanding how things went wrong later. I was not a man who made careless decisions. I was not a man who made careless decisionally, or acted without information. I had spent 25 years making precise judgments under pressure and being right enough at the time to keep the job. That is the context. The other context is this. I was never at home. I had 2 significant relationships in my adult life. The first was in my early 30s, a woman called Marie who worked in hotel reception and had the patience of a saint for about 4 years before running out of it entirely. The second was a woman called Claire, who I was with for 6 years in my 40s, and who was, if I'm being fair to her, perfectly clear from early on that she wanted someone who'd be present for the Sunday dinners and the bank holidays and the ordinary unremarkable evenings that make up a life. I was never there for those. I was in the kitchen. That's not a metaphor. I was literally in the kitchen. Different kitchen, not ours. You see the problem. Both relationships ended the same way. She got tired of the empty chair. I understood it each time in an abstract sense and changed nothing, because the kitchen was the only place I knew how to be. No children from either. No property. I rented my whole life, and the money sat in a credit union account in Limerick, earning whatever credit unions earn, which is not a great deal. The burnout, when it came, was not a surprise to anyone, including me. I had been running a kitchen in a 4-star hotel in the city. 200 covers on a busy night, a team of 11, the usual chaos of service, and I had been doing it for 4 years on about 5 hours of sleep and a stomach that had been trying to resign since approximately 2015. The panic attack happened on a Thursday afternoon in November 2019. I was in the walk-in freezer doing a stock check, which is a job I could do in my sleep, and something simply stopped. I sat down on a crate of frozen chips. I could not make myself stand up. Not physically, my legs worked fine. It was something else. It was like every system in the building had been running at full capacity for 30 years, and something in the boiler room had finally given out. You could see it coming if you'd looked. Nobody had looked, including me. My sous chef found me 20 minutes later, still sitting there. He was 24. He was very alarmed. I told him to start the prep for the evening service and that I'd be out in a minute. I was not out in a minute. I was not out in a minute. I was there for another 40. My GP signed me off for 6 weeks. I never went back. I retired on medical grounds at 51, which was both a relief and a thing I didn't fully understand the implications of for quite some time. What it meant, practically, was this. I was drawing an early Irish state pension, not enormous, but livable. The kind of thing that covers rent and groceries and not a great deal else. And I had my savings, €78,000 in the credit union account, accumulated over 3 decades of earning reasonably and spending almost nothing because I was always at work and had nowhere to spend it. And I had my flat in Limerick. 2 bedrooms I didn't need, a kitchen I barely used, a window that looked out at a car park. November, December, January. The rain coming in off the Shannon and the city going about its business without any particular need for me. I wasn't in a bad way, I want to be clear. I wasn't depressed in a clinical sense. I wasn't having dark thoughts. I wasn't a crisis. I was just structurally purposeless for the first time in my adult life. A commercial kitchen with all the equipment removed. The space was the same. The function was gone. I watched a lot of YouTube. That is not something I'm proud of, but it's the truth. It was how I spent the evenings in that flat, and the evenings were long. And one night in February of 2022, about 2 in the morning, the algorithm served me a documentary about banh mi production in Saigon. Street vendors, industrial bakeries, the whole supply chain of a sandwich that costs 30 cents and is, I would later discover, one of the finest things you can put in your mouth at any price point. I watched it twice. Then I watched another one. Then another. That, as it turned out, was the beginning of everything. The banh mi video led to a Bun Bo Hua video, which led to a 20-minute documentary about a woman in Hanoi who had been making bun tru from the same cart in the same spot for 41 years. I watched that one 3 times. Then I watched a street food tour of Hainan, then a cost of living comparison between Da Nang and Chiang Mai, then an expat forum discussion about visa options for retirees. Then it was 5 in the morning and I hadn't noticed. I want to be precise about what I was actually responding to, because I've thought about it a lot since. It wasn't the romance of the place, although Vietnam is a beautiful country, and I won't pretend otherwise. It wasn't the adventure of it. I'm 51 years old, and I've been on the North Sea in February. I'm not looking for adventure. What I was responding to was the food culture, specifically the seriousness of it. The way a woman who makes one dish for 40 years is not considered limited, but is considered a craftsperson. The way eating well is not a special occasion, but a daily expectation at every price point. I had spent 35 years in kitchens, where the goal was volume and margin, and getting it out hot. And here were people treating a bowl of pho at 6 in the morning like it deserved their full attention. That spoke to something in me that I didn't have a word for at the time. The practical arithmetic was also compelling, and I'm honest enough to admit it. My pension stretched to about €1,700 a month in Limerick, which covered the rent and the bills, and approximately 1 modest pleasure per week if I was careful. The same money in Da Nang, according to every forum thread I could find, would cover comfortable accommodation, 3 good meals a day, and still leave change. I was not going to get rich. I was not going to stop being careful. But I might, for the first time in my adult life, have enough of it to feel like I wasn't rationing. I spent about 3 weeks researching before I booked anything. I looked at visa regulations, the e-visa, regulations, the e-visa, the tourist visa extension, The various options available to someone with no job and no dependents, and nothing particular keeping them anywhere. I read forum threads about Da Nang versus Ho Chi Minh City versus Hanoi, and decided Da Nang on the basis that it was warmer than Hanoi, smaller than Saigon, and had a coastline, which seemed like it might be pleasant to look at on the days I wasn't eating. I rang my sister Aoife on a Sunday evening. She's 3 years younger than me, lives in Ennis, has a husband and 2 teenage sons, and a job in the county council, and a life that looks, from the outside, like it was assembled from a kit. We get on well. I told her I was thinking of going to Vietnam for a while. There was a pause. She said, "For how long?" I said I wasn't sure yet. I was going for a look. Another pause. She said, "Right. And then, is this because of a woman?" I told her no. It was because of a sandwich. She didn't find this as clarifying as I meant it. I booked a one-way ticket to Da Nang on a Tuesday morning. I had never been to Asia. I spoke no Vietnamese. I packed one medium-sized bag because I have spent my entire adult life working in environments where you move fast and carry only what you need. I gave notice on the flat. I rang Aoife again to tell her the date I was leaving. She said she'd pray for me, which is her way of expressing concern without admitting she's concerned. I landed in Da Nang in early March of 2022, at about 11 at night. The heat hit me coming off the plane like a physical object. Not unpleasant, just absolute. The way a kitchen during a full Saturday service is its own atmosphere entirely. The airport smelled of something I couldn't identify, sweet and faintly chemical, and outside the terminal there were motorbikes everywhere, dozens of them, idling and weaving with a confidence that suggested the traffic rules were more of a suggestion than a framework. I got a taxi to a guest house I'd booked from Limerick, €6 a night, clean, a ceiling fan, a window onto a narrow street. I lay down on the bed and listened to the city for a while. Motorbikes, a dog, someone's television, something that might have been a karaoke bar, 2 streets over. I fell asleep with the window open. The first week cost me €180 all in, including the accommodation. I checked. I am a man who kept kitchen cost records for 30 years and the habit doesn't switch off. €180 for 7 days. In Limerick, that would barely cover the rent for 2 nights. I ate my way through Da Nang with the systematic focus of a man doing professional research, which is more or less what it was. I found a Bainema cart near the market that I returned to every morning. The bread blistered and light, the pâté sharp, the pickled daikon doing exactly what pickled daikon should do, which is cut through fat and wake everything up. I found a Bon Bahua shop run by a woman who seemed mildly annoyed that I kept coming back, but served me without incident. I ate com tam, broken rice, grilled pork, a fried egg, for about 50 cents at a plastic stool on a pavement, and sat there for an hour, because there was nowhere I needed to be, and nothing I needed to do. And that was, I realized, sitting there with the motorbikes going past and the sun already fierce at 8 in the morning, the first genuine quiet I had known in approximately 30 years. I didn't ring anyone back home for the first 9 days. I want to be honest about that. I sent Aoife a text to confirm I'd arrived safely, and then I put the phone down and lived inside the days without reporting to anyone. It felt extraordinary. It felt like something I hadn't been allowed before, though nobody had been stopping me but myself. After 2 weeks in Da Nang, I took a bus south to Hoi An, an hour's drive, the road running between the mountains and the sea. I'd seen enough of Hoi An in YouTube videos to know it was a tourist town. The lanterns, the old quarter, the cooking classes aimed at people who wanted a holiday story involving a mortar and pestle. I knew I'd find it irritating. I went anyway because it was there and I had time. I was right that it was a tourist town. I was right that it was beautiful. Both things were true simultaneously, which I found mildly annoying. On my 3rd day there, I saw a handwritten sign outside a small shophouse near the market advertising a Vietnamese cooking class in English. 200,000 dong per person, about €8. I stood in front of it for a full minute debating whether to go in. My objections were professional. I was a trained chef. I had no need to learn to cook Vietnamese food from a class designed for people who'd never held a cleaver. I also had nothing else to do at 2 in the afternoon, and the alternative was walking around looking at lanterns again. I went in. The class was more or less what I'd expected. 6 tourists, an instructor who spoke good English and cooked with the kind of theatrical certainty that is for teaching rather than for the food, and a series of dishes that were simplified in ways I understood the logic of, but found professionally unsatisfying. The faux broth had not been going long enough. The rice paper rolls were fine. I kept my opinions to myself because I was a guest, and because I am, despite some evidence to the contrary, capable of social discretion. The translator was a woman standing slightly to the side of all this, rendering the instructor's commentary into English for the two tourists who needed it, and clearly doing the more interesting work of watching everyone else navigate their workstations. She was maybe late 20s, dark hair pulled back, wearing a plain blue shirt. She wasn't performing warmth the way tourism workers sometimes do. She was just present. At some point during the spring roll assembly, she looked over at my workstation and said something. Her exact words were, "Your knife is too flat. You're pushing it forward instead of rocking it. Your julienne is going to be uneven." She was correct on all counts. I looked at her for a moment. I said I was aware of that, and that I was choosing to push because the vegetable was going to be cooked anyway, and the texture wasn't critical for this application. She considered this. She said, "Fair enough," and went back to translating. After the class, I approached her and asked if she was local. She said she was from Quang province originally, but had been working in Hoi An for 4 years. I introduced myself. She said her name was Lin. We exchanged numbers on the basis that she knew the food scene well, and one wanted recommendations. That was the complete truth of it. Neither of us was performing anything. She told me about a place near the river that did Kao Lu properly. I said I'd try it. She said to let her know what I thought. I said I'd try it. She said to let her know what I thought. And 2 days later, we met for coffee because she said she was curious whether a man with my background had understood what made the broth different. She paid for the coffee. I found out later she'd been calculating exactly how to do this from the beginning. At the time, it just seemed like someone paying for coffee. We met for coffee a second time, 4 days after the first. She messaged me suggesting a place near the Thuban River, a small cafe that did coffee, which I had not encountered before, and which she described, accurately, as something I should form an opinion on before leaving Hai An. I went. It was extraordinary. Egg yolk beaten with condensed milk and poured over strong Vietnamese coffee, the whole thing tasting simultaneously like dessert, and like something you needed to function. I told her it was very good. She said she knew. That was the texture of it, those early conversations. Functional. A little dry. No performance on either side. I want to explain something about where my head was at this point, because I think it matters for understanding what came later. I had been in Vietnam for about 6 weeks. I was sleeping well for the first time in years. The tremor in my right hand, which my GP had attributed to sustained stress and suggested would improve with rest, which I had not believed because I had not actually rested in 30 years, had quieted to the point where I barely noticed it. I was eating exceptionally well and spending almost nothing. I was, in a word I don't use lightly, content, not happy in an effortful way. Just level. The boiler was off, and the building hadn't fallen down. I was also, I should say, being careful. I had read enough expat forums to have a working knowledge of the warnings. Western man arrives in Vietnam, meets young woman, she's charming and attentive. The money starts to move. I knew the shape of it. I told myself I was watching for it. What I was watching for was urgency. Fast attachment, early requests. The stories I'd read all had a particular texture. The woman seemed too interested too quickly, pushed for commitment, introduced the money conversation before the relationship had any real foundation. That's what I expected warning signs to look like. So I was watching for those specific things, and I wasn't seeing them. And I used that, consciously, I want to be clear, because I'm not going to pretend I was passive. I used the absence of those specific things as evidence that this was different. It was the first mistake. The absence of the expected warning signs was itself part of the architecture. I didn't know that yet. Over the next 2 weeks, I extended my stay in Hien. It was easy to justify. The town was pleasant. The food was excellent. My original plan had been open-ended anyway. I wasn't staying because of Lin. I was staying because I had no reason to leave. And Lin was part of the town now, in the way a good restaurant becomes part of a neighborhood. She was one of the good things about being there. We met every 2 or 3 days. Sometimes she suggested it, sometimes I did. She had her own work, administrative hours at the tourism company, occasional weekend translation jobs, a schedule that didn't revolve around my availability. Once she canceled plans because of a work obligation and sent a message that said simply, "Sorry, work today. Maybe Thursday." No elaborate apology, no rescheduling that came with visible anxiety about whether I'd still be interested. Just maybe Thursday. I noticed this. I filed it under. She has her own life. She's not pursuing. Good. Looking back now, I understand that every one of those small signals was placed. Not necessarily consciously. I don't know how calculated it was at each individual moment, but the overall effect was calibrated. She was showing me, precisely, the opposite of what I'd been told to look for. About 3 weeks in, the nature of the thing shifted. I won't make more of it than it was. I'm 51 years old, and she was 29. And I had no illusions about the strangeness of that gap. But we were spending most evenings together by then, and one evening it became something else, and neither of us made a speech about it. Gradually, and then all at once. She was smart. That was the thing I kept coming back to. Not in a general way, she was specifically smart about the things I was smart about. She had strong opinions about food, and they were usually correct. She had read the same situation twice, in the cooking class and in a restaurant, where I ordered something I later admitted wasn't what I wanted, and she had said without cruelty, "Why didn't you order what you actually wanted?" It was the kind of observation that a person who has spent their whole life being competent finds oddly destabilizing. She saw clearly. I found that attractive in a way I didn't entirely understand. We took a weekend trip to Hua in late May. A 4-hour bus journey north, the road cutting through the Hevon Pass, with the sea on one side and the mountains on the other. Hua had been the imperial capital, and it had the food to match. Bun Bo Hua with its lemongrass, forward broth that was nothing like the versions I'd eaten in Da Nang. Bon hoi crisped in a clay pan. Sia hoi crisped in a clay pan siam hong cold rice with tiny clams that was the strangest and best breakfast I'd had in my life. I spent the whole weekend eating and talking about what I'd eaten, which is how I've always operated, and which Lynn seemed to find more interesting than most people had. I paid for the accommodation and the transport. She paid for 2 of the meals. We didn't discuss the split. It felt natural. 2 people on a weekend away, managing the costs as they came. I spent perhaps €300 across the weekend, including everything. I didn't think about it. That, I now understand, was the first financial stage beginning. Not a request, not a dramatic gesture. Just the ordinary arithmetic of 2 people spending time together in a country where everything is cheap. So cheap that spending feels like nothing, even when it's adding up. By the end of July, I'd spent approximately €800 on Lynn-adjacent things, meals, day trips, the Ha weekend, a few smaller expenses. €800 over 2 months. In Limerick, that would have been a month's groceries and utilities. In central Vietnam, it was a pleasant life with someone I liked. The numbers felt meaningless. That was precisely the point. I met her friends during this period. A group of 3 or 4 women she worked with or knew from Quang Nam, gathered one evening at a restaurant near the market for someone's birthday. They were warm and curious, and practiced at making a foreign guest feel at ease. I ate well and spoke in simple English and drank 1 beer, because I don't drink much. There was one man in the group. He arrived late, sat at the far end of the table, ate quickly, and left before the desserts. Lynn introduced him as Fook, a friend, she said, from back home, works in finance. He shook my hand and said it was nice to meet me, and his expression suggested he found neither the meeting nor its niceness particularly notable. I remember thinking he seemed brusque for a social occasion. I remember thinking nothing else about it. His name was Fook. I'll come back to him. Towards the end of July, we were sitting one evening outside a cafe near the river, the ceiling fans moving the warm air around without noticeably cooling it, the usual traffic sounds, and somewhere a television broadcasting what seemed to be a Vietnamese game show. Lynn was talking about her mother. Just talking, not urgently, not leading anywhere, the way you mention someone when they're part of your daily thoughts. Her mother was in Kyung Nam, about an hour south. She'd been having some health difficulties lately. Nothing catastrophic, but the hospital had been involved. I asked what kind of difficulties. She described it in general terms. Cardiac, she thought, though the doctors were still investigating. She'd been in twice in the past month. I said I was sorry to hear it. She said, I was sorry to hear it. She said, it's okay, we're managing. No ask. No implication. Just a woman telling me her mother wasn't well. I went home and thought nothing particular about it. But that conversation was the hinge. Everything before it was the early part of the story. Everything after it was something else entirely. I just didn't know that yet. Sitting there with my coffee while the ceiling fan moved the night air and the game show murmured from someone's open window, and Xi'an went about its ordinary evening business without any concern for what it was setting up. 2 weeks after that conversation, Lin asked if I'd like to go with her to visit her mother in Xingnam. Not framed as anything significant. She was going on a Saturday. She had the day free. Would I like to come? I said yes. We took a grab car south from Heian, about 50 minutes, into a part of the province I hadn't seen, away from the tourist corridor, into the kind of town that has a market and a main street and a hospital, and not a great deal else. Her family home was a low concrete house set back from a side road, with a small yard where someone had planted vegetables in careful rows, and a motorbike parked under a corrugated awning. Her mother was a small woman in her mid-60s who moved slowly and sat down carefully, and had the particular gray quality of someone whose energy is being rationed by the body itself. You don't need a medical degree to recognize that. I've worked in kitchens long enough to know when someone's running on reserve. She was polite to me in the way of a woman who has good manners and not quite enough breath to deploy them fully. Lin's younger sister was also there, and a cousin or neighbor, I wasn't entirely clear which. A meal was produced. Not for my benefit, or not only, this was clearly normal hospitality for a Saturday visit, but they had cooked more than usual, and the best things were put in front of me. I ate what I was given and said it was excellent, which it was, and the sister translated this for the mother, who seemed pleased. After the meal we sat, and Lin translated a conversation between me and her mother that was mostly about where I came from and what I thought of Vietnam. The mother had opinions about Irish weather, based on nothing in particular, but delivered them with confidence. I agreed with all of them. It was a pleasant afternoon. On the drive back, Lin mentioned the hospital situation more specifically. Her mother had been diagnosed with a cardiac arrhythmia. The medication was managing it. But there had been 2 admissions already, monitoring, tests, the costs adding up. She showed me some of the bills on her phone without being asked, scrolling through photographed receipts. I looked at the figures. Vietnamese hospital costs are not what a European expects. They are not ruinous by Irish standards, but they are not trivial either. And for a family without significant savings, they accumulate quickly. The bills she showed me totaled somewhere around 80 million dong, roughly 3,000 euro. She put her phone away. She did not ask me anything. She looked out the window at the road. I want to be absolutely clear about what happened next, because I've thought about it many times since, and I haven't changed my account of it. She did not ask. I offered. I said I could help with some of that, if it would be useful. Her exact response was, "You don't need to do that." I said, I knew I didn't need to. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Thank you," and looked back out the window. We didn't discuss a specific amount that day. A few days later, I transferred 80 million dong, approximately 3,200 euro, to her Vietnamese bank account. We agreed it was a loan. Neither of us put that agreement anywhere in writing. At the time, this felt right to me. The kind of thing you don't formalize between people who trust each other, because to formalize it would be to imply you didn't. Looking back now, I understand that the absence of paperwork was not an oversight. It was a feature. I felt good about it. I want to be honest about that too, because the feeling matters. I felt useful in a way I hadn't since the freezer. A chef understands about family situations and money. You spend 35 years in kitchens watching people ring in sick because of school fees, or a parent's hip replacement, or a sibling who needs bailing out. You learn that financial emergencies don't announce themselves at convenient times, and that a person who has a little extra has an obligation to share it when someone they know does not. That's kitchen culture. That's how I was conditioned to think about these things. I didn't overthink it. I had €78,000 earning nothing in a credit union in Limerick. €3,200 was nothing. It was less than I'd spent in 6 months of sitting in the flat. It was less than I'd spent in 6 months of sitting in the flat doing nothing. 2 months passed. The loan was not mentioned again by either of us. She didn't raise it, and I didn't raise it, and eventually I quietly reclassified it in my own head as a gift, and felt fine about that too. I was fine about it. I am being precise about this because I don't want to imply I was secretly agitated and ignoring it. I genuinely let it go. It was the kind of letting go that seems like generosity, and is actually the first loosening of your grip on something important. October came. The weather shifted slightly, still warm, but with an edge in the evenings that hadn't been there in May. I had been in Vietnam for 7 months. I had a routine, a flat I'd moved into in Da Nang, a relationship with someone I respected and found interesting and was under no illusions about, and a growing sense, tentative but real, that this was not temporary, that this might be what the next chapter looked like. And then Lynn mentioned the business, not as a pitch. I want to be clear about that because the absence of pitch was itself the mechanism. She mentioned it the way you'd mentioned that your company was restructuring, informational, slightly rueful, something that was happening and required navigation. Her tourism company was being absorbed into a new entity. Several of the staff were being offered the option to buy in as minority stakeholders in the new venture. The new venture was going to focus on European visitors specifically, tour packages, translation services, cultural consultancy, higher margin work than the general tourist market. Over the following 2 weeks, we talked about it in the way you talk about things that are interesting but not yet decided. She was considering whether the buy-in made sense for her. She asked my opinion on the tourism market because I had spent months eating my way through the region and had views. I had views. I also had, and this is the thing that made it specific to me, a potential role. Food tourism for European visitors. Menu consulting. Someone who understood both sides, the European palate and the Vietnamese kitchen. She said this, and it was not untrue. I could see myself being useful. I could see myself being useful. I could see a version of the future where I had a function. I asked for the documentation. She produced it. Business registration, company structure, projected revenue, the proposed stakeholder agreement in English. I read it carefully. I am a man who cost-managed kitchens for 20 years. I can read a financial document. It looked legitimate. It was legitimate. In many of its components. That was what made it work. I found a lawyer through an expat forum in Da Nang, English-speaking, Vietnamese, qualified, €40 per consultation. I brought him the documents, qualified, €40 per consultation. He reviewed them over 2 sessions, charged me €150 in total, and told me the registration was in order and the structure appeared sound. He noted one clause he'd have preferred to see worded differently, but said it was not unusual for this type of arrangement. I thanked him. I felt due diligent. I felt like a man who had done his research, rather than a man who had done his research, rather than a man who was being managed. The initial ask was €18,000 for a 5% stakeholder position. I negotiated. I said the projected revenue figures didn't support that valuation at current market rates, which was a sentence I was able to say with authority because I had spent 2 weeks reading about Vietnamese tourism economics specifically in order to have it. We went back and forth over several days. We settled on €14,000. I considered this a reasonable outcome. I had saved €4,000 through negotiation. I felt sharp. Thuk appeared during this period with more regularity. Introduced now not as a friend at a birthday dinner but as someone adjacent to the business, he knew the principles of the new venture, had done currency exchange work for expats connected to the company, was a useful contact for the financial side of the buy-in. Lynn mentioned him in this context naturally, the way you'd mention an accountant you'd worked with before. There was one moment with Thuk. I remember clearly. We met at a cafe in Da Nang to discuss the transfer mechanics, how to move the investment money efficiently from my Irish account. Folk was explaining something about bank thresholds, and I asked a specific question about which account the funds would be registered to. He answered, and the answer was technically responsive but didn't quite address what I'd asked. I noticed this. He had dark eyes and spoke quickly, and I remember thinking his manner reminded me of a supplier I'd dealt with in Limerick. a meat supplier who always answered the question slightly adjacent to the one you'd put to him. I had eventually stopped using that supplier. I didn't stop dealing with folk. I filed the observation under different culture, different communication style, probably nothing. I transferred €14,000 in late October. The documents were signed, my name was on the stakeholder agreement. I had a role, a future, a person, and for about 6 weeks I allowed myself to believe, without qualification, that things had worked out reasonably well. That was the highest point. Everything after it was a different kind of story. The banking conversation started in November, about 3 weeks after the business transfer. Not as a conversation about banking, that's important to understand. It started as a practical observation. Lynn made one evening while we were eating at a place near my flat in Da Nang, a small restaurant where they did a keiko tea, caramelized fish in a clay pot, that I had been eating 3 times a week since discovering it in September. She said, almost as an aside, that she'd been having difficulty receiving funds from the business account efficiently. Transfer fees from international sources were higher than expected. There were threshold limits on what her Vietnamese bank account could receive in a single transaction without triggering delays. It was a minor administrative irritation, she said. She was looking into the options. I listened. I had no particular response because I had no particular knowledge. I had a credit union account in Limerick and a pension. I had never owned property, never had a mortgage, never managed anything more financially complex than a kitchen's ingredient budget. I was not a financially sophisticated man. But I was a logical one, and what I understood from the conversation was, international banking has friction. This is true. I knew it was true from the business transfer itself, which had involved its own delays and intermediary fees. I filed the observation away as background information. The conversation came up again a week later. Slightly more specific this time. Phuc's name appeared in it. His currency exchange service was used by several European expats in Da Nang for exactly this reason, she said. The fees were lower, the transfers faster, the process better suited to people moving money between European and Vietnamese accounts on a regular basis. She mentioned, specifically, a Dutch man and a German couple she knew of who used it. This was probably true. Phuc's business almost certainly served legitimate customers. That was part of what made the reference work. A third conversation, more specific still. The most efficient structure for the business operations, Lynn explained, would be a locally held account accessible to her for day-to-day costs, into which I could transfer funds once rather than in multiple smaller transactions, avoiding the threshold problem entirely. The account would be managed through Phuc's exchange service, which had the infrastructure for this. I would be named as a joint holder, so the funds would remain, in a legal sense, mine. I asked questions. I want to be clear about this because it would be clear about this because it would be easier to say, I didn't, and I'm not interested in making it easier. I asked how joint account protections worked in Vietnam. Phuc explained, and his explanation was plausible and delivered with the confidence of a man who does this regularly. What I did not know, what I had no mechanism to know, because I had not consulted a Vietnamese banking lawyer independently, because I had consulted the wrong lawyer about the wrong documents, because I had no framework for what I didn't know, was that joint account protections under Vietnamese banking law do not function the way I assumed from an Irish context. The named joint holder in the arrangement we signed did not carry the veto or consent requirements I believed it did. I assumed it meant neither party could withdraw without the other's agreement. It did not mean that. The account was, in functional terms, accessible by whoever was the primary account holder in Phuc's system. That was not me. I did not know this. I want to say that plainly because I've spent considerable time since asking myself if I should have known it, and the honest answer is, I should have found out. I should have taken those documents to a different lawyer, one I found independently, with no connection to anyone in this chain, and had them translated and explained. I didn't. I took Phuc's explanation at face value because it was logical, and because I was a man who had already decided he was in a legitimate business arrangement with a person he trusted. I transferred €38,000 in late November. We were sitting in a cafe on Trien Pho Street in Da Nang when I did it. I logged into the credit union app on my phone, Lynn beside me with a coffee, the street outside doing its usual morning business. The Exiom drivers and the school children and the woman who sold banh mi from a cart directly in front of the cafe window every day at 7. I moved the money. The transfer confirmed. Lynn looked at the screen and said, "Thank you, Declan." And we finished our coffees and I paid for them, which I mentioned not to suggest anything, only because I remember the ordinariness of it. The completely domestic unremarkableness of having just moved €38,000. I had, at that point, approximately €26,000 remaining in Limerick, plus my pension income. I was not cleaned out. I was not panicking. I felt, and I say this with full awareness of how it sounds, like a man who had made a considered decision. The first weeks were uneventful. The account existed. The balance was visible through a statement. Fuck's service provided monthly. Lynn referenced business expenses occasionally, marketing costs, a licensing fee, initial operational costs for the new entity. I saw corresponding withdrawals in the statements. The figures were consistent with what she described. I was monitoring, as I'd been told I could. Everything appeared to function. There were 4 things I noticed during this period that I want to account for carefully, because in retrospect, they form a precise record of the architecture I was inside and couldn't see. The first, in early December, Lynn described the business ownership structure in a way that differed slightly from how she described it in October. Not dramatically, a different emphasis on which entity held the primary registration, a different framing of who the other stakeholders were. I noticed the inconsistency. I raised it gently. She gave an explanation involving a restructuring of the parent entity that was, again, plausible in the way that things are plausible when you don't know enough to challenge them specifically. I accepted it. Filed under, complex business arrangements changed during setup. The second, Fuck always arrived at meetings after Lynn had spoken to me about the meeting. Always. He never called me directly, never appeared without prior context, never initiated contact of any kind that hadn't been preceded by Lynn normalizing his presence. At the time, I interpreted this as professional courtesy. She was the relationship, he was the service provider. It made sense that she mediated. Looking back now, it was coordination. They were managing what I knew and when I knew it. The third, I was reviewing the business registration documents one afternoon. The originals I'd kept in a folder, and noticed that the company registration number on page 1 differed from the registration number referenced in the body of the document on page 4. A 4-digit discrepancy. I am a man who costed menus for 20 years. I noticed numbers that don't match. I raised it with Lynn. She said it was a document versioning issue, an administrative error from when the company changed its registration status, and that she'd get a corrected copy. The corrected copy arrived 10 days later. I compared the numbers. They now matched. I filed it under, resolved. The fourth, and this is the one that I come back to most often, because it was the clearest signal and I understood at least at the time. In mid-December, I mentioned to Lynn, in passing, that I was thinking of transferring a small amount to a wifey in Limerick. Not for any particular reason, just to keep the credit union account active, to have something moving through it. A few €100. Lynn's response was immediate and just slightly off register. Her exact words were, "Why would you do that now? The exchange rate isn't good this week." It was true that the exchange rate wasn't particularly good that week, but the flustering was real. A woman who was consistently composed had, for about 4 seconds, not been. I noticed it the way you notice a temperature change in a kitchen, not alarming, just factually different from the baseline. She recovered immediately. The conversation moved on. I told myself, she's stressed about the business launch. Probably nothing. I did not transfer any money to AOFA that week. I don't know, now, whether Lynn had a specific reason to prevent it, or whether it was a general anxiety about any movement of my funds she couldn't track. I'll never know. January came. The business was supposedly approaching its soft launch. Lynn was busy. Meetings with the operational team. Occasional evenings where she was distracted and I didn't push. Life in Da Nang continued otherwise as it had. The ta, the morning banh mi, the walks along the Han River. The occasional message to Aoife that I was fine and eating well and not to worry. On a Wednesday evening in the second week of January, I was sitting in the flat reading when my phone showed an SMS from the Vietnamese number I'd been given to monitor account transactions. I glanced at it. It showed a withdrawal notification. The amount was not unusual for a business expense, about 2 million dong, roughly 80 euro. The destination account number was one I didn't recognize. I looked at it for a moment. Then I sent Lynn a message asking about it. She replied within 10 minutes. The exact explanation was that it was a payment to a logistics contractor for the launch event. She'd mentioned this contractor before. She was sorry she hadn't flagged the specific payment in advance. The explanation was fluent. It addressed the question directly. It was not evasive. It was exactly what an honest answer would have sounded like. I said, "Fine. Could you send me the contractor's details for my records?" She said, "Of course. She'd send them tomorrow." Tomorrow came, no message. I didn't follow up immediately. She was busy. She'd said, "Tomorrow." I'd give her a day. The day passed. I sent a reminder. She said she was pulling the paperwork together. 2 more days passed, and in those days, something shifted. Not dramatically. I didn't have a revelation. I didn't wake in the night in a cold sweat. I simply began, for the first time in 9 months, to sit very still and read. I opened the Expat forums on a Thursday morning, not looking for anything specific, or telling myself that, anyway. Just reading. Catching up, I said to myself, on things I should have read earlier. I found the first post within 20 minutes. A British man, retired engineer, Da Nang, posted 8 months earlier. He described meeting a woman through a work contact, a gradual relationship, a business investment opportunity, a currency exchange intermediary, a joint account structure that turned out not to protect him the way he'd understood. He'd lost £22,000. The post was detailed and precise, and written in the flat tone of a man who had finished being shocked and moved on to documentation. I read it once. Then I searched the forum for similar posts. The second was from a Dutch man in H.A. Trang, posted 11 months earlier. Different woman's name. Different business sector. Same structure. Currency exchange, intermediary, joint account. Investment layer. He'd lost 31,000 euro. He described, specifically, the way the account protections had been explained to him and how they differed from what he later discovered the law actually provided. I sat with that one for a while. The third post was the one that finished it. An Australian in Da Nang, 6 months earlier, who described a conversation about bank transfer thresholds and fees that was word for word, not similar, word for word. How Lynn had introduced the banking topic to me in November, the same explanation. The same reference to other expats who use the service, the same framing of the joint account as protection rather than vulnerability. Different name, same architecture. I read all 3 again. I didn't feel panic. I felt what I'd felt in the freezer, the sudden absolute stillness of a system that has stopped. Very cold. Very clear. I called Lynn's phone at 11 that morning. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I left no message. I called again at noon. Voicemail. I sent a message asking her to call me when she had a moment. The ticks went blue, red, and stayed red. No reply. By 2 o'clock, I had stopped waiting. I messaged again. I need you to call me today. Please. Read. No reply. On Friday morning, I took a grab to the street where Fuchs Currency Exchange office operated. I had been there twice before, both times with Lynn, both times for meetings that had been scheduled in advance. I knew the building, a narrow shop house off a side street in the Hai Shao district, a hand-painted sign above the door, the window that had always had the lights on. The lights were off. A metal shutter, the rolling kind, was padlocked down over the entrance. The padlock was new. I noticed this because I am the kind of man who notices this. The paint on the shutter was old and scuffed. The padlock was clean and bright. A woman from the adjacent business was sweeping the pavement. I approached her and mimed a question about the closed shop, pointed, raised my hands, made a questioning face. She spoke in Vietnamese, gesturing in a way that might have meant they left, or I don't know, or both. I thanked her and took out my phone and photographed the shuttered door. I don't know why I did that. Evidence, perhaps, though for what and for whom, I couldn't have said. It just seemed like the kind of thing that should be documented. I went to the first bank that afternoon. I showed the account documentation. explained the situation as clearly as I could through a combination of English and a translation app. A manager was produced after a wait of 40 minutes. She was professional and careful with her English, and confirmed what I had begun to understand. The joint account structure as I had described it did not confer the withdrawal consent protections I had assumed. The account's operational authority rested with the primary registered holder. That was not me. She was sorry. There was no immediate mechanism for reversal. I should contact police and consult a lawyer. The second bank confirmed the same. Different words, same conclusion. The police station took 2 hours. An officer who spoke some English took my details and produced forms and was genuinely, visibly sympathetic. He had clearly heard something like this before, which I found simultaneously reassuring and bleak. I was given a case number. I understand now what a case number means in this context. It means we have recorded that this happened. It does not mean we will recover what was taken. I thanked him and left and stood on the pavement outside the police station in the Da Nang afternoon heat and made a list on my phone of what I needed to do next. I have always made lists. It is how I function under pressure. In a kitchen, when everything goes wrong at once, the grill fails, the sous chef doesn't show, the fish delivery is short, you stop, you list, you prioritize, you execute in order. Emotion is for later. The list said, embassy, pension documents, lawyer, awifit. I booked the earliest available flight to Hanoi. The Irish embassy there had a consular services line, and I had rung it already from the police station car park and spoken to a woman who was practical and kind and told me to come in as soon as I could. On the flight north, I stared out the window at the cloud cover over the Central Highlands and did a full accounting. 38,000 euro from the account, 14,000 from the business investment, which I now understood was either entirely fictitious or structured in a way that made my stake irrecoverable. 3,200 from the loan. The assorted smaller expenses, the lawyer's fee, the costs around the account setup, a few other things I could trace to this chain if I was honest. The total came to approximately 55,200 euro. I had about 22,000 euro left in Limerick, plus the pension, once I'd confirmed it was still coming. It was this last item that became, in the following days, its own separate emergency. During the chaos of the account collapse, I had remembered a document Lynn had asked me to sign some months earlier, residency paperwork, she called it, a form required to formalize my long-stay status. It had been in Vietnamese. She had summarized it for me verbally. I had not had it independently translated because I trusted her and because I was, as I've said, a man who had already decided what he thought of the situation he was in. Through the embassy, I found a British expat whose Vietnamese partner agreed to translate the document from a photograph I'd kept on my phone. The translation took a day. The document was not purely residency paperwork. It included language that referenced my pension as an income source within the account structure, the account that folk controlled. The exact legal implications were unclear even to the translator, but the connection existed, in writing, with my signature on it. When I contacted the Irish Department of Social Protection to verify my pension entitlements, multiple calls, over several days, trying to explain a situation that was complicated to explain coherently, while also being exhausted and in Hanoi, the volume and inconsistency of my queries triggered an automatic review flag. I didn't know this was happening. I found out when the payments simply stopped arriving. Suspended pending verification. That was the phrase, no income. An account emptied, 22,000 euro in Limerick that I could not readily access from Vietnam without fees and delays. A hotel room in Hanoi that cost 12 euro a night, which was what I could afford. I rang AOIFA on a Tuesday evening. It was 7 in the morning in Ennis. She answered on the second ring because she always answers calls from me quickly, and I don't ring early unless something is wrong. I told her what had happened. I gave her the facts in order, the account, the amount, the business investment, the loan, the pension situation. I kept my voice level because there was no alternative. She was quiet through most of it. When I finished, there was a silence of about 5 seconds, and then she said, Declan. Just my name, just that. I told her I was managing, that the embassy was helping, that the pension situation was procedural and would resolve. She said she'd wire me money. I said I'd pay it back. She said she knew that. She didn't say anything else for a moment, and then she said, "Come home when you can. Just come home." I said I would, and I sat in the hotel room in Hanoi with my phone in my hand and the street noise coming through the window. Motorbikes, a vendor, someone's music, and I made another list. The 6 weeks between the pension being suspended and the pension being reinstated were, in practical terms, the most difficult period of my adult life. I want to be precise about that comparison because I've had difficult periods. The burnout was difficult. The freezer was difficult. This was different in a specific way. I was in a foreign country, largely alone, with very little money coming in. A shrinking reserve I was trying not to touch, and nothing to do but wait for bureaucratic processes in two countries to resolve themselves on their own schedules. Aoi wired me €1,500. I told her I'd repay it, and I meant it, and I did repay it, in 3 installments over the following year. That's not a detail I need to include, but I'm including it because it matters to me that I repay what I owe. It is perhaps the most Irish sentence I've said in this entire account. I moved to cheaper accommodation in Hanoi, a guest house near the old quarter at €8 a night. A narrow room with a window that opened onto a light well, and the smell of pho stock rising from the kitchen 2 floors below every morning at 5. I ate cheaply, which as it turned out was something I could do with some skill. A bowl of bun bo at 40,000 dong, banh mi for 25, egg coffee when I needed something that felt like a small luxury, which was occasionally. I spent perhaps €12 a day on food and accommodation combined. In any other context, this would have felt like an extraordinary bargain. In this context, it felt like rationing, because it was. The embassy consular team were helpful in a way I hadn't anticipated. A woman there, I'll call her Shaban because that's her name, and I'd like it on record that she did her job well, helped me prepare a coherent written account of the pension situation to submit to the Department of Social Protection. The framing mattered. This was not a man whose entitlement was in question, but a man whose confusing communications had triggered an automated review that needed human intervention to clear. That framing, calmly presented, moved things forward. 6 weeks from suspension to reinstatement, with back payments included. I was told this outcome was not guaranteed. I believe that. When the pension came through, I sat in the guest house room for a long time without doing anything in particular. The faux stock smell was coming up through the light well. A motorbike alarm was going off somewhere on the street. I did not feel relief so much as the end of sustained tension. The particular quiet of a kitchen after the last service is finished, and the extraction fans are off. I booked my flight home on a Wednesday. A one-way ticket, Hanoi to Dublin, with a connection in Doha. I had arrived in Vietnam with a one-way ticket. I was leaving the same way, which I found grimly symmetrical. The night before the flight, I sat in my room and did a final accounting. The way a chef does a stock take at the end of a season, not with emotion, just with accuracy, to know where you stand. €55,200 lost. Approximately 20,000 remaining in Limerick. Pension intact and restored. Physical health, the same as when I'd arrived. The tremor had quieted and had not returned to its pre-Vietnam levels, which was the one thing I hadn't expected to keep. My knees still hurt on stairs. My hearing was still compromised in the left ear. These things were the same. I was not destitute. I want to be clear about this because there is a version of this story where a man loses everything and is broken, and that is not this story. I had lost a significant amount of money. I had lost 9 months I'd spent trusting someone who was constructing a version of herself specifically for the purpose of being trusted. I had lost the version of the future I'd been building in my head during those 6 weeks in October, when I thought things had worked out. Those are real losses. I'm not minimizing them. But I was going home with a pension and €20,000 and my life more or less intact. And there are men who have come out of situations like this with considerably less. I landed in Dublin on a grey April morning that was almost comically Irish. Low cloud, fine rain, the motorway from the airport looking exactly as it always has. The flat was the same. Obviously it was the same. I've been gone 13 months, not a decade. The same car park outside the window, the same ceiling, the same kitchen I barely used before I left, which I now found I was using more, partly because cooking something for yourself is a way of organizing an hour. And I had a lot of hours again. I went to one counseling session, in June, at Aoi Fei's insistence and with her booking the appointment because she knew I wouldn't. The counselor was a perfectly reasonable man in his 50s who listened carefully and asked useful questions. I found it helpful, in a limited way. I have not booked a second appointment. Arstes Bondas. What I would tell someone not don't trust. That is the wrong lesson, and I know it. A life built around not trusting people is not a solution. It's just a different kind of loss. The lesson is structural. Let me be specific. Get independent legal advice. Not a lawyer recommended by anyone in the transaction. Not a lawyer you found on a forum used by the same community you're being integrated into. A lawyer you found entirely separately, who has no relationship with anyone in the chain. Pay them properly and give them everything. Get independent translation of every document before you sign it. Every document. If someone tells you it's just paperwork, that is not a reason to skip the translation. It is, if anything, a reason to insist on it. Never make banking decisions within a relationship. If a financial structure is proposed to you, any structure, no matter how logical it sounds, take it away, sit with it for 2 weeks without discussion, and then have it assessed by someone unconnected. The delay will either reveal something or cost you nothing. The delay will either reveal something or cost you nothing. Not during the crisis. The information was there. 3 posts, describing the same scheme with different names, were sitting in a publicly accessible forum while I was having the banking conversation in November. I didn't read them until January because I had decided what I thought and wasn't looking for information that might challenge it. That is a human failing, and I am not immune to it. But it is a correctable one. And the last thing, the one I come back to most. The €800 in the first 2 months. The €800 in the first 2 months made the 3,200 made the 14,000 possible. The 14,000 made the 38,000 feel like a natural extension of something that had already been decided. Each number was normalized by the one before it. If I had looked at €55,000 and been asked to move it all at once, I would have stopped. I would have made a list and consulted someone and waited. The reason I didn't is that I never moved €55,000 at once. I moved 800, then 3,200, then 3,200, then 14,000, then 38,000. 4 transactions over 9 months. Each one felt proportionate to where I was in the process. Looking back now, the process was the mechanism. I don't talk about Lynn with anger. I want to be clear about that because people sometimes assume the endpoint of something like this is rage, and it isn't, or it isn't for me. What I feel when I think about her is something closer to grief. Specifically, the grief of losing someone who never existed. The Lynn who made the correct observation about my knife technique. The Lynn who paid for coffee. The Lynn who sat with me at her mother's kitchen table while the sister translated. That person was a construction, but the experience of her was real. You can't go back and unhave a real experience by learning it was engineered. It happened. I felt it. It cost what it cost. I have found a Vietnamese restaurant in Limerick. Apparently, which surprised me because Limerick is not a city you associate with Vietnamese cuisine. I've been into the better of the two several times to talk to the owner, a woman from Hanoi Ni who has been there for 11 years and makes a bún bò that is not authentic by Vietnamese standards, but is considerably better than anything else available in a 20-kilometer radius. We've had a few conversations about the broth. She thinks I'm fairly opinionated for a customer. She's correct. The bánh mì ni is, as I said to her once, suboptimal. The bread is too soft. The pate is a commercial brand, and the daikon isn't pickled long enough. But it's what's available. And I appreciate what's available more than I used to. That's Declan's story. And I think he said everything that needs saying, better than I could say it, and more honestly than most people manage when they're talking about their own mistakes. What I'd add, briefly, as context, the scheme Declan encountered is not unique to Vietnam. Versions of it operate across Southeast Asia and beyond. But it's particularly well documented in the Da Nang and Hainan corridor, specifically because that area attracts a particular kind of expat, not the romantic chaser. Though those come too. The thoughtful one. The one who's done some research, who knows about the warnings, who is watching for the things they've been told to watch for. That man is, in some ways, more vulnerable than the man who arrives with his heart on his sleeve, because the scheme that catches the careful man is designed to look like the thing the careful man is looking for. The slow pace was the mechanism. The coffee she paid for was the mechanism. The negotiation from 18,000 down to 14,000, down to 14,000, was the mechanism. Everything that made it feel unlike the stories he'd heard was, in fact, the story. If you're watching this because you're planning a move abroad, the resources are linked below, not to scare you off, but to arm you. The information that protects you is the same information Declan found in those forum posts in January. The difference is when you read it. If you're watching this because something in Declan's story sounds familiar from the inside, please use those resources. There's no version of this where the right move is to wait and see. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it. That's all. Just share it. The best protection is information that arrives before it's needed. Thank you for watching Inside Vietnam. We'll see you next time.